Well, it's good to see everybody come back to this particular chapter meeting after Don in the first chapter meeting. I know he challenged everybody to make a commitment, and I'm glad to see you are. Thank you very much for stepping up to that. Today what we're going to speak about is the whole idea, who are the enemies of liberty? What is going on? And the reason we go through this is to give us focus. As activists, there are plenty of things we can get engaged in, a lot of things we can do. Well, at the beginning on the surface, it all might look valuable and important. In reality, we need to get to the root cause. When we get to the root cause that's taking away our liberties and we deal with that, then we're being effective. So I'm going to help to give you a little bit of focus. I'd like to bring out who are the enemies of liberty. First off, I'd like to say it's not the Republicans. It's not the Democrats. This is not a conservative versus liberal, right versus left. That we see that in the media as portrayed as a battlefront, so to speak, in American politics today. In reality, it's not that at all. We need to have a national dialogue. We need to have these conversations. When somebody brings up an idea, we need to have people in opposition speak against it so that we as Americans can properly evaluate it. So to have that debate in Congress is not bad, or other halls of representatives where they meet. That's all a good thing. Our real enemy are those who amass power immorally and illegally and do so by stripping away at the liberties of the many. They gradually carve away at the liberties of the many and the resources of the many for their own personal empowerment, endearment, and all. That's the real issue. And these few, whoever they are, they work within both parties. They work in all aspects of our government and our society. We need to recognize that threat and deal with it. The truth be told, it's an age-old threat. We see an early account of this in the book of Genesis, through the Tower of Babel. Here we have in this society what's going on is our first world government. And you had the few who had a great deal of power over the many. They were all intrigued by a new technology that they had, bricks, the ability to make bricks. And they built this edifice. And what did they do with it? They built it to the glory of man. All those people at that point were under that governance. Why were they there? What is the agents the government uses to motivate people to work for them? Force. So what I'd like to do now is show you the modern day Tower of Babel and what's going on. How it is that today, who are these agents that are the few in number taking away the liberties of the many? I'm going to show you two organizations. First, I'm going to tell you who they are, and then I'm going to explain how they work and the problem with how it is that they work. By understanding this, we will then know what we need to do to take back our liberties and restore the liberties that, frankly, our generation has never seen. We don't understand this concept of liberty in many ways. The first one is the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank is an institution. It's a privately held bank, organized in the early 1900s. Basically, they were granted a monopoly. But before getting into that, what I'd like to do is talk about what banking looked like in much of our nation's history before that. What is a bank? Well, let me ask you this. What's a citizen? What do they do with their wealth? Let's say you have an individual. He goes out and he farms and he produces some wheat. Or maybe he raises cattle and he's got a bunch of cows out there. At this point, he consumes some, but the rest of it he'd like to sell off and store his wealth for future consumption or whatever it is he wants to do with it. So how does he store his wealth? He may sell his cattle or his wheat and convert it to gold. Now let's say he has 100 ounces of gold as shown in this model right here. Well, that's a lot of gold to carry around in your pocket. What happens if you get robbed? There's problems, bouncing around. It's a very durable source, and it does retain its value. It's tough to carry. So an individual might want to store it. So there's a specialized storage unit. We call it a bank. And what the bank will do is actually warehouse it for us. Now, when you take your gold down to the storage unit of the bank, they're going to give you a receipt. Okay, they write one out saying you have 100 ounces of the gold. Whoever has this receipt can come to the bank anytime and get their gold back. So the bank comes along and they print the receipt. The citizen deposits the gold in the bank. The bank goes ahead and gives the receipt to the citizen, and they do the exchange. Now, in this model, Who has the power? Tell you who has the power. It's the citizen. They still own the gold. Who has the responsibility? The bank has got a lot of responsibility. They now have the responsibility of protecting and guarding and securing that gold for the owner, the true owner, which is the citizen. This is the right model because the citizen created the wealth. That individual created the wealth. They should have the power over that, what to do with it, how to dispose of it, how to consume it. We call this hard money, just so you know. That's the name for it. Well, what these banks were doing was they get a little sneaky, as you might guess. People can get a little sin nature in us. And even though this was considered illegal, they would do something. They ran a little printing press. And they would print an extra receipt. And it said on there, backed by gold. Yeah, we've got 100 ounces of gold behind this receipt here at our bank. And then they would lend it out to some other citizen. Imagine that. And that same citizen now, having this receipt, claimed to be backed by gold, he'd go to the hardware store, trade that for lumber, and then the owner of the hardware store could go to the bank and get the gold. Well, let me tell you something. There's no gold there. You know how to make a banker a praying man? The first time he starts printing out these receipts, not backed by gold, he falls on his knees and prays that not everybody brings back those receipts all at once to be redeemed for gold. It's the game that he's playing because there's no difference between the two receipts. A little while later, what he's hoping for is the citizen will pay him back with interest, and in this case, let's say it's $5 interest on that $100 note, and the banker makes some money. You think about that. We call this fiat currency. It's essentially fake money. That's what it means. Notice the difference between hard money. On fiat currency, the banker lent out the money. The citizen is in debt, has to pay back with interest. Let me ask you something. Under the fiat currency model, who has the power? The banker. The citizen is in debt. Proverbs 22:7, the borrower is a slave to the lender. You see, when you're lending money, you like that verse for the other reason. All right? When you're the borrower, you're being warned about that verse, which was King Solomon's intent. Now, what happened with the Federal Reserve? Well, bankers got together, well-placed, known as a money trust, largely coming out of New York. They saw a problem here because people would see this for what it was. The banks out there around the country, occasionally one bank could print too many dollars. People would realize what's going on. They'd have a run on a bank. It would go bust, and you'd find people broke because, like musical chairs, the last one doesn't get his gold, just like the last one doesn't get his seat in musical chairs. Same problem. So a few bankers got together and said, Mr. Government, we can solve this problem. You grant us a monopoly status. We'll create a new bank. Everybody, all those banks out there that are warehousing gold, will have it all delivered to us, and we'll give them new dollars called Federal Reserve notes. Now, you know where all that gold is stored? Because they did accumulate it. Well, it's at Fort Knox. All right, it's where it's sitting, in theory. And the dollars went out. Well, that was nice how it started. At the very beginning, 1913, with the Federal Reserve Act, those dollars that initially went out in Federal Reserve note, they were backed by gold. And you could trade them back in and get gold. Well, but what also was a part of that, when the Federal Reserve Bank put together this whole system, you know that fiat currency portion? They kept that going too. They actually legalized that. It's in the Federal Reserve Act. They were allowed to print extra receipts. And they started printing. And they kept printing. And they kept it on going. And in the 1930s, they became very aware they had far too much money out there. And they were not going to redeem it all for gold. They couldn't. So what they did, passed another law through FDR saying American citizens could not redeem their Federal Reserve notes for gold anymore. All of a sudden, playing musical chairs, all the chairs were removed. Everybody had the dollar, and they could not trade it for gold. Early 70s, Nixon did the same thing, took foreign governments and foreigners and said, you can't trade your Federal Reserve notes for gold anymore either. What happened then? Hard money completely disappeared. All we had left was a fiat currency. Now, as soon as we did that, who has all the power? The owners of the Federal Reserve Bank. They're regulated by the government? Are they? Do you know who one of the biggest borrowers of money from the Federal Reserve Bank is? By trillions of dollars, our own government. The borrower is a slave to the lender. Now, there's so much money that the Federal Reserve Bank has lent out, and they've earned so much money in interest and lent it out again, earned it interest and kept lending it out, kept printing money. At this point today, there's no way the entire debt can be paid off. There is not enough dollars out there in existence that are actually owed back to the Federal Reserve. So as a result, we're stuck. Somehow or another, we need to end this system. And you know all that gold in Fort Knox? We can't trade it in our dollars for it anymore. Guess who controls it? The Federal Reserve Bank. They're the de facto owners of all that gold. All that dollars we pay back in interest, you might say they bought it. We need to end this system. You know, people often think of the president through controlling, has control of the economy, he can influence it. You imagine the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank going to the president, you know, I like you as president. I think we'll drop interest rates by a quarter point. Economy will feel a little better, you'll win the election. By the way, I could raise interest rates by half point. You got an election coming? So by the amount of dollars that get lent out, brought back in and paid off, our economy wanes. You create a bubble, or you can make it burst. That power resides in the Federal Reserve Bank. And yet we as Americans often look at the president, throw out the bums because of the state of our economy. That's the power these folks have. One more thing about fiat currencies. If you take a look at our history of fiat currencies going back some 500 years or so, what happens is bankers will start them and they'll actually maintain them and be responsible with it. But events happen where they start printing too much money. Gradually they get to the point where they just print huge quantities of money, the currency goes bust, the economy of some nation tanks, and it can often lead to war because the nation's vulnerable, and wars are often what they use to finance it. Fiat currencies, borrowing money that did not exist before from the Federal Reserve Bank, is a great way to pay for wars without raising taxes. You can see why politicians like the idea of the Federal Reserve Bank. They can keep going with their agenda. Now here's a graph that came out of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. If you take a look at this graph, you can see 1913, there were just a few dollars out there. They maintained that gold standard for a little while, and they kept the number of dollars limited. World War II came along, and there's a small little increase. Had to fund that war. And one of the things they did was print money. Late 60s, you come along with the Great Society, you know, that President Johnson was promoting. All of a sudden, our debt begins to pick up. All the way up to the 2008, you can see where we increased our money supply. And then in the fall of 2008, the number of dollars out there doubled in the fall of 2008, while George W. Bush was president. This was the first bailout and the stimuluses were coming along. Now, we don't feel that yet through inflation because a lot of those dollars aren't being circulated. People are sitting on them. As soon as they begin to circulate it, we're going to feel that heat. Our dollar is tanking right now, and this is normal. This is normally what happens. Bad things happen when that occurs. We need to end this system. All right, enemy number 2, the Council on Foreign Relations. Who are they? Why is it that they're an enemy? Well, what makes sense is to let them speak for themselves.
Every component of our nation's future, and therefore our children's future, the future of this country, this generation, is contained within the arc of foreign policy. Trade, energy, national security, our relationships around the world, our competitive positions around the world.
And I think 9/11 taught us that we're in a globalized world, and issues in Yemen and Afghanistan and India and Pakistan affect people in Michigan and California.
So the American people have the opportunity, have the responsibility to know what's going on.
A lack of information and a lack of perspective is as much an enemy to good governance as any kind of partisan fights.
I think in a generation where we have so many blogs and so much quick information and little sound bites, even if you really are committed, it's very hard to know who to trust and where to go.
It's only by questioning your assumptions that you can really think through to the heart of whatever it is you're dealing with.
You can't fundamentally understand a problem unless you bring a very diverse range of perspectives to it.
And if you don't have venues and forums and processes by which this becomes possible, it's very difficult to move forward.
And you turn to places like the Council on Foreign Relations.
We're a venue, we're a publisher.
A research organization, a membership organization.
It's a community of policymakers, of people who follow policy closely.
It's really a nonpartisan think tank, and the fellows represent a huge spectrum of political views.
The council tracks people from a variety of different perspectives, and also from a variety of different backgrounds, from the business community, from NGOs, from labor.
To cultural leaders, religious scholars, academics.
And you connect them with the people in government, ideas in government.
The council provides also a prestigious forum for foreign leaders.
We're a magnet. People know they can come here, they trust the space.
They can be honest about what they think, and that's very difficult to achieve in the public forum.
And we don't always agree, but we learn as we listen.
It's a repository, it's a reference shelf on everything going on in the world.
Not just the critical issues, but anticipating what's coming.
CFR makes it very accessible. I think between the website, the podcasts, and Foreign Affairs, you can really absorb it.
Foreign Affairs is one of the best publications in the business.
The value of this is that it actually contributes to debates that shape outside of the United States about global issues.
CFR has maintained its relevance even as the world is changing dramatically.
I am always 6 to 9 months away from my next trip to Afghanistan and Iraq. And before I go, I rely on the resources of the council. I think it would be foolish not to.
I think the general public should think of the council as a tremendously valuable resource to decision makers all through our society, decision makers in public life, decision makers in private life, and now particularly with the website, to themselves.
We need societies like the Council on Foreign Relations, where public issues can be frankly, freely discussed and analyzed.
To educate Americans about what the issues are.
To engage the younger people and the next generation of foreign policy leaders.
And the more we're able to do that, the more informed people will be during debate, and I hope that the better the public policy that results from it will be.
So if we can become a place where people can get smarter, where ideas can get produced and debated and disseminated, then we have contributed to the quality of the debate, which in turn will affect the quality of the policy. People matter, ideas matter.
Well, that was a great presentation put out by the Council on Foreign Relations. It is their own slick glossy. They're trying to present themselves in a fair light so that people can understand who they are, their vision, and where they're going. And at first blush, it looks very appealing. After all, solving world hunger, ending all wars, who would not be drawn by that vision? It is an appealing vision. I like that as well. But I'd like to encourage you to look at them from a different angle. What I want you to do is follow the dollars. Who does the CFR benefit? You know, if I look at a man's checkbook, I can tell you who they are. Where do they spend their money? How do they acquire their money? It tells you a great deal about their character and what their true mission is. The CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, is no different. You want to see who they are? Let's follow the dollars, and then we'll see, are they ending world hunger? Are they ending all wars? Let's see what goes on. Follow the dollars. I want to give you an example of where members of the CFR in its very early days, even just before it was formed or as a formal organization, what they did. I want to give you an example in Russia. Early 1900s, 19-teens, the Bolsheviks had taken over in Russia to set up the communists and put them into power. And at this time, in order to have a revolution to take over a country, it takes money. I don't care where you're at, what country, it simply takes money to hold a revolution and take over a nation. So, where did the Bolsheviks get their money from? Well, let me show you part of it. 1917, a gentleman by the name of William Thompson, he was an American, a director of the Federal Reserve. He and 15 other financiers, Americans, and attorneys joined a Red Cross mission to Russia. They went over to that nation. And in the middle of the revolution, do you think they were there to man a soup kitchen and hand out blankets? No, that's not what they did. It was simply a front. What they did was they channeled money through themselves, through that organization there, not really through the Red Cross, but they used it as a front to get money to finance the revolution. Within a month of themselves setting up shop, the other people that were there on that mission within the Red Cross, they saw for what was going on and they left. These 15, they stayed. What's an example of some of the work they did? Well, $1 million, and mind you, this was when $1 million was actually backed by gold, and it meant something. This was when $1 million was real money. J.P. Morgan gave $1 million, funneled it through Thompson to the Bolsheviks. Now these Bolsheviks, the communists, they remembered their benefactors. Later on, when the revolution was over and they nationalized all the banks in Russia, you know what they didn't do? The National City Bank branch in Petrograd was not nationalized. In the middle of communist USSR, there was a private bank. This was the bank that helped to fund the revolution. We also have as well $20 million given by a less known name, Jacob Schiff, another American. He also gave that money to the Bolsheviks to help them finance that revolution. That was a lot of money. Well, why would they do that? Let me ask you this. Why is it that well-placed American businessmen who prospered and succeeded under the free enterprise model, why would they finance the overthrow of another nation and put communists into power of all things? A whole economic model that they didn't live under. Well, because you can benefit from it. Think about that. You take a communist nation, millions of consumers, one customer, the government. You go negotiate terms. If you're a businessman working on the international scene, you can go to one government, one customer, negotiate terms, fix the price of your product. You can make a sweet little price, a sweet little deal, and prosper by it. It sure beats having to set up a bunch of dealerships all around the country, retail outlets to sell your wares. That is a lot of work. It's simply a lot easier. Let me give you an example of this. 1920s, Rockefellers, new name, same crowd, CFR crowd. Rockefellers bought Russian oil fields, built refineries, and helped sell Soviet bonds right here in America. Now, why was this advantageous? Well, the communists, when they took over Russia, they needed capital. They needed the investment in their own infrastructure. They needed a means of getting the oil out of the ground so that they could consume it. Well, these American businessmen were there to help out. They helped to finance it by building these refineries, getting the oil out of the ground. Of course, they got their cut off of a fixed price that the consumer was forced to pay. That's the nature of a centralized economy. It was mutually beneficial. Americans financed the aluminum rubber plants as well as the Kamar River truck factory. That factory later on helped to produce tanks that faced American soldiers during the Cold War. I'm a Cold War soldier. I happen to take that personal. U.S. presidents helped. I'm not going to state how they helped right here in this time. We don't have enough time. But I want you to realize that it was there. What are the results of Russia? As we know, millions of people died in a communist takeover. Millions of dollars were made by well-placed select American businessmen. They did this through the instrument of the CFR. Do I like what the CFR represents? The CFR in many ways is just another private organization like JBS. It's just people coming together, they have a common vision, and they share a common publication, Foreign Affairs, just as we'll share a common publication through the Bulletin. Same idea. It's just a private organization out there. But their goals at the core, the people that take advantage of that within the inner circle of the CFR, they got a problem. The outer ring of the CFR, I believe, is made up of people who truly believe the vision you saw in that commercial, that advertisement. But the apple is rotten at the core, folks, and it's a real problem. This is just an example of it. Let's move on. These international businessmen, the select few that use the CFR as a tool, as an instrument, they gave rise to the USSR, Nazi Germany to a lesser extent, and even communist China. Communist China, you might ask? How did they do that? Well, let me explain. You see, in the early 1900s, when the CFR was just coming about, these businessmen would use their own money to finance the Russian Revolution, the communist revolution within Russia. But on the other hand, that gets a little risky. What happens if the war doesn't come out in their favor? They lose a lot of money, right? But it did come out in their favor, and they prospered. By the time you come up to the 40s with China, early 40s, you have Mao Zedong, agrarian farmer supposedly, in reality a communist organization within China, trying to take over China. There's essentially a civil war going on with nationalist China under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. It was a republic. Chiang Kai-shek was their president, and they were having a civil war. That time, Japan comes in, and the beginning of World War II begins to make inroads into China, conquering the land. Well, at the end of World War II, there's this deal that's cut. What happened was 5 days after the atomic bomb was dropped, 1945, Lend-Lease program. Now, this program lended a lot of aid by America to some 40 nations throughout World War II. But after the atomic bomb was dropped, there was a whole bunch of aid by America that went through Russia right to communist China. Roosevelt's plan, he was actually deceased at this point, so he didn't carry it out, but it was his plan, essentially gave Stalin 3,000 tanks, 5,000 planes, food, fuel, and ammunition for a 1.25 million man army. This is twice, more than twice, the total aid that was given to Chiang Kai-shek. Remember, he's a leader of the nationalist China throughout all of World War II. At the very tail end, when the war is effectively over, all this aid is given to Stalin, and he sent it directly to Mao Zedong. Russia also entered China, the northeast area, the Manchurian railroads and all took it over, and in order to contain that. During this time, our aid going to nationalist China, was delayed. Our military aid going to them was delayed. And yet we were supplying, our government was supplying Mao Zedong. Now, how is this possible? How is it possibly be set up? You see, the CFR had matured. At the early days, its founding members and all, they used their own money. But a couple decades had passed to the 40s. Now they got members that were going into the State Department. They were being appointed to positions in the State Department. You essentially had a revolving door. They had simply matured and seasoned as an organization and were working through the State Department. That is how they had their influence. What does that have to do with all this? Read this quote by General Patrick Hurley. At that time, he was a U.S. ambassador to China. He said, American diplomats surrendered the territorial integrity and the political independence of China and wrote the blueprint for China, the communist conquest of China, in a secret agreement at Yalta. Here's how it worked, folks. The atomic bomb was dropped on Japan was dropped during the summer of 45. During the winter of 45, February timeframe, there was Stalin and President Roosevelt got together with others, and they basically laid out the plan for how it is they're going to end World War II and what they were going to do after that. It's, according to Hurley, is at this time, the American diplomats, they had a strong hand. At this point, Roosevelt was physically weak. He died a month later, all right, but the American diplomats laid out this plan that was then later on carried out, all right, according to Hurley, that gave China to the communists. Who is the senior diplomat who made this possible? His name is Alger Hiss. He devised his plan by which all the aid was given to the communist Chinese. He did it through the Yalta Agreement. He was also the one that got America involved in the United Nations. The earlier attempt, League of Nations, right after World War I, it failed. America didn't join. It died on the vine. Alger Hiss was the one who successfully got the United States engaged in the United Nations. Later on, he was exposed as a communist spy. That's the impact of a man in the State Department. The battle goes on. During his time as well, we have the Brentwood Conference. Bankers got together in Brentwood, an area up in the New England states, at a hotel, nice resort there, and they set up two instruments at that point. The first one is they created the International Monetary Fund. Mind you, they're setting the stage now for post-World War II. They know America's going to win, the Allied force is going to win, so what will this new stage look like? They set up the International Monetary Fund, which was basically a means of establishing exchange rates between currencies around the world. They introduced the idea of a single currency globally at this point. They didn't think people would accept it, so they shelved it for the International Monetary Fund. They also set up the World Bank. This is a debt forgiveness program. Let me explain to you how the World Bank works. Here's the general idea. You got some wealthy investors or bankers, they want to go ahead and make some money, so they lend some money to build a dam in some small country out there, wherever it may be. And they build this dam, produces electricity, it produces clean water for the community around it. On the surface, not a bad deal at all, huh? Now, let's say the investment goes bad. They're not making enough money to pay back the debt. No. One of the options might well be to go to that government and say, how about nationalizing the dam along with its debt? And that way you can go ahead and set the prices so we don't have to compete. At the same time, if that doesn't work, you can actually raise taxes on your people to pay back that debt because you've nationalized the debt as well. And if that government doesn't want to cooperate, says, I'm not sure we like that idea. You know, sometimes go along with it, sometimes they don't. Let's say they don't go along with it. Great. Now, you can go and finance the military to come in and take over that country. You have a coup. You overthrow the government. After all, it's a small country. You finance the overthrow, you put in a friendly government. And what does a friendly government do? Well, they're very thankful because now they're the new government. These people that are in, they get it. They pay back that debt. Let's say all that doesn't work. Let's say the bankers are still not getting paid back the money that they lent, that they simply printed, by the way. They lent. What do? Well, you'll hear this on occasion on the news. World Bank comes along, and they take some money, our tax dollars, by the way, and they're going to help out this small, poor third world country by giving them the money and forgiving them their debt. And where does that money end up going? Back to the bankers so they get paid off. Our tax dollars are paying off the bankers because that third world country couldn't do it. That's essentially the mechanism when you get right down to it. That's what the World Bank's all about. I got permission to bring this out and to say this. There's a pastor in the Oklahoma City area. His name is Tom Vineyard, Windsor Hills Baptist Church. He was a missionary to Africa for 15 years. During that time, he experienced 3 civil wars. He was presenting at one time, discussing that his time as a missionary and what happened. I asked him, out of the blue, I said, who is behind these civil wars? He looked straight at me and said, the World Bank. Apparently, there was some kind of common knowledge going on. It wasn't a great secret. It may have been in our media, but not over there where he was at. He understood what was going on and who was behind it. Folks, that can't continue. That model continues on right through the United Nations with the non-governmental organizations they have set up. That needs to end. How do we end it? Not by killing the CFR. It's a private organization. We need to kill their mechanism. We need to get out of the United Nations. In conclusion, here's the solution. Number 1, get out of the United Nations. That is the mechanism of choice where the few take advantage of the many. And the many are us. We need to end the Federal Reserve. We need to go back to the model of currency we had before the Federal Reserve Bank was granted. Keep in mind, the Federal Reserve Bank's just a monopoly. All we have to do is allow for competing currencies, and the Federal Reserve note will either strengthen and do it right, or it'll wither on the vine. We don't simply have to end the Fed. We can phase it out. And that eliminates their mechanism by which they hold so much power over us. We need to follow the Constitution. The idea of the Constitution is distributed governments. We have a weaker federal government, stronger states and local governments, and these local governments compete against each other to provide the best services to the people. That's what works. That is a very good model. That's what we need to encourage ourselves to go back to. And we also need to remember the 500. Folks, encourage your friends and neighbors to get committed, get active, join JBS, become part of the 500. Right now our numbers are less than 500 per congressional district. We carry some influence, we carry some weight, but we want to truly restore a nation. Do we want to restore our liberties? We've got to get to that count of 500 because then we become the single most influential factor in determining our next congressman is. And why do we emphasize that so much? What about Congress? Let me tell you something. I don't care who the president is. I don't care who the 9 Caesars are. I don't even care who our senators are. The reality is the House of Representatives, where all appropriations begin. It's where all our spending gets initiated from. It's where all the revenue gets generated. We get the right congressman in there. I'm not sure what that number is. It's not a majority. It takes a minority of congressmen. I'm not sure what the number is, but we get them in there to sit on their hands and stop spending money. It's like cutting the head off the snake. Our nation's restored. We limit the size of our federal government by having representatives that simply say no. And they mean it. And we can take back our nation and restore our federal government to the place it needs to be instead of the self-destructive path it's on right now. Notice, the president is not mentioned in this list. Gateway politics, everybody gets concerned about who the next president is. I'm not worried about who the next president is because it doesn't matter. There's such a mechanism and atmosphere built up around them. It doesn't matter whether it's Republican, Democrat, who the individual is. We need to go after our congressmen at the national level. That's where the influence is held. Don't quit just because your president got elected. That has happened in the past. And activism has waned, and the few, the elite, have won for another day. The references, everything I brought out, you can find in The Creature from Jekyll Isle. I encourage you to pick up this book and read it. You can read it in Shadows of Power by James Perloff. This is an outstanding book, excellent source references to back up the content that you see. James Perloff also wrote an article in the New American that talks about the information I presented on China. Well-sourced, well-documented. It's just not the common documentation that you find out in the media, but a lot of it is government documents you can simply Google and find. All right? It's just we don't know to look for them. This is our focus. With the idea of the CFR and the Federal Reserve defeating them, putting them down, and getting back to a model of distributed governance, that's where we need to go as activists. That's where we need to devote our energy. There are plenty of other good causes out there. Focus. If we focus on this, we're in good shape. You take a look at the bulletin. The bulletin is dedicated to this focus. All the legislation chosen in there to either promote or defeat is geared towards the idea of ending these two systems I brought out. That's why we need to focus on that and stay on that. Our local activism needs to promote those same causes, just as you see in the national agenda. At this point, I'm done, and I'd like to open it up to some questions. Good job. Thank you.